Hey guys, welcome to Peripheral Vision, and today we're taking a look at the 3D control pad for the Sega Saturn. It's a circle. I just want to get that out of the way right now. It is in fact a circle. And I wish I were a fly on the wall at the meeting where they made that design decision, because what did they even say? We're just gonna draw a circle, throw some buttons on it, and the kids will go nuts? Well, they didn't. This wasn't a very successful controller at all. But it is pretty interesting, so let's take a look at it. To begin, this controller was originally bundled with the game Nights into Dreams for the Sega Saturn. And the reason it was bundled with it is because Nights into Dreams is a 3D platformer, and the 3D control pad has a very interesting addition to the Sega Saturn control lineup, and that is the analog stick. You see, most Sega Saturn controllers up to this point, and none after actually, all of them had this stuff right here. But they didn't have this, because they didn't need to. Most of the games were 2D platformers, or they just didn't need an analog stick for precise 3D movement, but Nights into Dreams did. And there were a number of others that did, actually, a total of around 40, 42, somewhere in that area, but this controller is specifically for those games. And that's not where the interesting stuff ends, though, but let's just look at the basic stuff. On the right side, we have 6 face buttons, and unlike most 6-button Sega controllers, they're all identical in the way that they are laid out. Normally they have different textures from the top and bottom rows, but these are all identical, so that's something. Down here we have the start button and the oh-so-popular Sega circle with a weird pivot thing going on here. And then we've got the switch. The switch alternates between digital mode and analog mode. And in digital mode, this is functionally just a regular Sega Saturn controller. This doesn't work at all. In analog mode, the analog stick works. And the reason there's that switch there is because although certain games did work with this controller specifically, other earlier Sega Saturn titles would not recognize it. They just wouldn't recognize this is a controller if it was in analog mode, so you have to switch it over and play it like a Sega Saturn controller. And honestly, if you're going to play a game just to play a game without this deal, I would just use a regular Saturn controller, because it doesn't actually feel as awkward as you might think, but it's a little bit more awkward to play using the D-pad with this controller than a standard Saturn controller. But on the back, we have this stuff, and what's really cool about this controller is that it's the first controller to ever have analog shoulder buttons, and you see them pretty much all the time in current consoles, but an analog shoulder button is one that has varying degrees of pressure sensitivity, so if you put it down a little bit, it has a different reaction than if you put it down all the way, and you see those types of controllers especially in racing games, but this is the first controller to do that, so yes. And finally, in the oddity department, we've got a detachable tail. Well, it's technically a cord, but I call it a tail in this case, because you can take this little thing and pop this right off. And the reason for that is actually because the Sega Saturn controller was supposed to have extra peripherals that you could connect into this, but unfortunately, because the controller didn't do well, the peripherals never came to fruition. And that is the 3D control pad for the Sega Saturn. An interesting little controller that I kind of like. It's pretty pricey, so unless you specifically want to play a Sega Saturn game that only uses this type of controller, I really can't recommend it. Or if you're a collector, I could recommend it, but you know what? It's a cool little controller. It's sort of weird though, that whole circle thing. It's a good thing they never went with that again, like they never made another big, ridiculous, and bulky controller that, oh my god, they did. Okay, Sega. Blasting off again. And as always, later days.